Hello everyone. Help us choose the new voice for the channel. If you prefer the voice used in stories 1 and 2 of this video, write voice 1 in the comments. If you like the voice used in stories 3 and 4, write voice 2. Thank you for participating. I've never been the type to believe in scary stories about hiking trails, but after what happened to me and my girlfriend in the Appalachians, I can't brush them off anymore. We're the kind of couple that loves exploring lesser-known trails, far from crowds, you know? That's exactly why we decided to venture onto this unmarked path in a more isolated area. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal, just a narrow trail surrounded by tall trees with that peaceful, secluded vibe. I even joked, saying something like, "Imagine if we find some secret spot no one knows about." That thought kept us moving forward. After about 30 minutes of walking, I started noticing something odd. Some of the trees had these strange scratches, long and deep, and I pointed them out to her. We laughed it off, a little uneasy, saying it was probably a bear or something, but the vibe started to feel off. Then we came across old campfire remains, burned wood pieces, and rusty cans scattered around. There weren't any fresh footprints, no sign of people nearby. Just the forest, quiet except for the faint rustle of wind through the leaves. I tried to shake it off, but something about the place felt wrong. As we kept going, that uneasy feeling just grew stronger. The trail seemed less and less defined, almost like no one had used it in ages. That's when we realized it might be a good idea to head back. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, but the signal was spotty, pretty normal for that area, but it still made me anxious. We decided to retrace our steps, but then came the first real problem. Everything looked different. The trees with scratches, we couldn't find the same ones. And what had seemed like a clear path earlier now just looked like random patches of forest. That's when I heard a faint sound like footsteps, but far away, echoing through the trees. I tried to rationalize it, saying it was probably just an animal, but my girlfriend was visibly on edge. The sound would start and stop, always seeming to match our pace. We decided to pick up the pace ourselves, but then the trail just disappeared. It was like it had never been there. Nothing but trees surrounding us in every direction. The air felt heavier, and the forest was eerily silent except for those footsteps, now sounding closer. It felt like something or someone was circling us, staying just out of sight. After wandering in what felt like circles for another 20 minutes, we saw something that seemed like a way out, a small clearing with what looked like an abandoned campsite. There was a torn-up tent off to the side, backpacks scattered and half buried under leaves, like they'd been left there forever. But what really freaked me out was how everything looked like it had been left in a hurry. There were shoes, an old flashlight with dead batteries, even some open cans of food that had gone moldy. My girlfriend froze when she spotted a black notebook lying near the tent. It looked worn and weathered, but some of the pages were still readable. I didn't want to open it, but she insisted. At first, the entries seemed normal stuff about what the person ate, the birds they saw, basic hiking journal stuff. But as we flipped through, the tone got darker. The writer started mentioning strange sounds in the woods, footsteps following them, and the feeling of being watched constantly. The last entry we could make out said something like, "They're closer today. I don't think I'll make it out." I felt a knot in my stomach, and both of us had the same thought. We needed to get the hell out of there. We tried to leave as quickly as we could, but the forest felt like it was closing in on us. The sound of footsteps that had been distant before was now coming from all directions. I kept telling myself it was just paranoia, but every snap of a branch or crunch of leaves made me jump. It wasn't just the noise, it was this overwhelming feeling, like we were being watched up close. My girlfriend started crying, and honestly, I wasn't far from breaking down myself. Then we stumbled onto something that made my blood run cold. In a small clearing, there was a stack of rocks, carefully piled in a way that looked intentional. It wasn't big, but it looked fresh, no moss or dirt on it, like someone had been there recently. Next to it was a dirty, crumpled t-shirt with what looked like dried bloodstains. My girlfriend lost it, and I could feel panic taking over. Whoever left that wasn't far, and it definitely wasn't random. We knew we had to keep moving, but the problem was, we had no idea which way to go. We decided to follow where we thought the sun was setting, hoping it would lead us back to the main road, or at least to somewhere more open. But the forest seemed to twist and turn around us, like it was playing tricks. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, and worse, it didn't sound like just one person anymore. It was like there were several sets of feet moving around us, but no matter where we looked, we couldn't see anything. Just the trees and shadows. My mind was racing, and I started to wonder if we'd been followed from the moment we stepped onto that trail. That's when the worst thing happened. I turned to say something to my girlfriend, but she wasn't behind me anymore. She had been right there, just a few feet back, and now she was gone. I yelled her name, my voice echoing through the trees, but there was no answer. I ran back to where I thought I'd last seen her, but there was nothing, just some broken twigs and disturbed leaves on the ground. Panic hit me like a freight train. I kept shouting for her, circling the area, but the only sound I could hear was the crunching of my own footsteps and those eerie, distant steps that never seemed to stop. After what felt like forever, I finally heard her voice. It was faint, like it was coming from far away, but it was definitely her. I ran toward it, yelling that I was coming, but when I got to where the sound seemed to be coming from, there was no one there, just an empty clearing with more of those scratched-up trees. What really terrified me, though, were the scratch marks on the ground, long and jagged, like something had been dragged through the dirt. Her voice stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving me in complete silence again, except for the wind in the trees and my pounding heart. I pulled out my phone, hoping to use the GPS or call for help, but of course, there was no signal and my battery was almost dead. Desperation started to kick in, and I decided to mark the spot on the GPS in case I somehow found a signal later. But before I could do anything, a loud crack echoed above me. I looked up and saw something hanging from a branch of dirty cloth sack, swaying slightly in the breeze. I don't know why, but every instinct in me screamed to get out of there. I took off running, yelling my girlfriend's name, not even caring where I was going anymore. Camping in the Appalachians seemed like the perfect idea for a quiet weekend. My friends and I decided to explore a remote spot far from the marked trails, hoping to avoid tourists and have a more authentic experience. We set up our tents near a small creek, and the evening started off great, laughing and swapping stories around the fire. The place was truly isolated, the only sounds were the crackling firewood and the natural noises of the forest. But around midnight, the peaceful vibe shattered. Out of nowhere, a man appeared in the dark, sitting near our fire, not saying a single word. He didn't look lost, he just sat there, staring at us like he was waiting for something. We tried talking to him, asking if he needed help or if he was camping nearby, but he didn't respond. He just kept staring, completely still. It was beyond unsettling, but since he didn't do anything threatening, we awkwardly tried to brush it off and went back to what we were doing. After a few long, tense minutes, the man suddenly got up and walked into the woods without a word, vanishing into the darkness like he was never there. We all felt a wave of relief, but the night wasn't the same after that. Nobody admitted they were scared, but you could feel the unease in the air. We reinforced the camp as best we could and headed to our tents, hoping the rest of the night would be uneventful. The next morning, something felt off right away. As soon as I stepped out of my tent, I noticed our stuff wasn't where we left it. Our backpacks, which had been neatly organized the night before, were scattered around and obviously rummaged through. When we checked, we realized some things were missing: food, a flashlight, and even one of our water bottles. I couldn't shake the chill running down my spine as I thought about that man from the night before. My friends tried to play it cool, saying maybe it was an animal, but we all knew that didn't add up. Still, we went through the motions of breakfast, pretending everything was fine. After talking it over, we decided it was best to pack up and leave early. No one said it outright, but it was clear we all wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. We started hiking back along the same unmarked trail we'd taken to get to the campsite. At first, everything seemed fine. But after a couple of hours, we noticed something that stopped us in our tracks: boot prints in the dirt. The thing is, they weren't ours. The prints were fresh, following the exact same path we were on. And what made it worse was the realization that, in some spots, they were dangerously close to ours, like someone had been walking right behind us. When we noticed the boot prints, the tension skyrocketed. We all went quiet for a while, trying to listen for any signs of footsteps, but all we could hear was the sound of our own boots crunching on the ground and the usual forest noises. One of my friends tried to brush it off, suggesting it could be a hunter or another hiker, but none of us really believed that. The prints were perfectly aligned with ours, and the fact that we hadn't crossed paths with anyone the entire trip made it feel even more unsettling. I finally worked up the nerve to shout, "Hello?" "Is someone there?" But all I got back was the echo of my own voice. The feeling of being watched was almost suffocating. A little further down the trail, we decided to stop and look around, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when we noticed something even creepier. The footprints just stopped in the middle of the trail, like the person had stepped off into the woods. Looking around, we saw some bush and branches that looked pushed aside, as if someone had been hiding there. That was enough to get us moving again fast. We tried to keep calm and walk quickly, but no matter how far we went, that feeling of being followed never went away. Every rustle of leaves or crack of a twig had us spinning around, expecting to see someone right behind us. As we kept moving, the paranoia started eating at all of us. My heart was racing, and I was hyper-focused on every little noise. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a branch snapping behind us. We froze and whipped around, but there was nothing there. We stood there for what felt like forever, staring into the empty forest, convinced someone was out there watching. It felt like a twisted game of cat and mouse, where the rules were completely stacked against us. We decided there was no stopping anymore. We had to get out of there. But as we picked up the pace, the footprints started reappearing, this time even closer to ours. Then, around a bend in the trail, we came across something that made my stomach drop. One of the backpacks we'd lost was hanging from a low branch, like someone had left it there intentionally. None of us wanted to go near it, but curiosity got the better of us. One of my friends grabbed it, only to find it empty, except for the flashlight we'd lost completely drained of batteries. At that point, we knew we weren't imagining things. Whoever was out there wasn't just following us. They wanted us to know it. We decided to ditch the original trail and take an alternate route that led to a small ranger station. It was further away, but we figured it was our best shot at finding help, or at least putting some distance between us and whoever was out there. The problem was, no matter how fast we walked or how careful we tried to be, the signs kept showing up. More boot prints, crushed leaves off the path always fresh, like they were just a few steps ahead or behind us. It felt like we were being toyed with, like whoever it was knew exactly where we were going and wanted to make sure we knew they were still there. When we finally reached the ranger station, it was a relief until we got closer. The place looked abandoned. One of the windows was shattered, and the door was slightly ajar. The whole building had this eerie, untouched vibe, like no one had been there for years inside. It was worse. The room was a mess, dusty furniture flipped over, old supplies scattered on the floor. But what made my blood run cold were the fresh boot prints on the dusty wooden floor. They were identical to the ones on the trail, and they led straight to the back of the room, where they just stopped. We didn't wait to find out more. We bolted out of the station and headed toward the main road, which was still a few miles away. The whole time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree. But there was never anyone there. The forest seemed dead quiet, almost too quiet, except for the sound of our hurried steps. By the time we reached the road, it felt like we'd escaped something we couldn't even name. No one said a word as we piled into the car and drove off, leaving the campsite and that nightmare far behind us. To this day, none of us can explain what happened out there. Who was that man? Was he the one following us? Why didn't he ever confront us? The scariest part is thinking about how close he might have been to us the entire time. And even now, I can't shake the thought that he's still out there, waiting for someone else to stumble across his path.
I've been a runner for over a decade, and running alone on trails never scared me. In fact, it's my peace of mind. Last month, during an early morning run on the Appalachian Trail, one of my favorite routes, something happened that I still can't explain. It was around 6:30 a.m., and the fog was thick, covering the trail like a heavy blanket. The silence was almost complete, except for the rhythmic sound of my shoes hitting the dirt. I was in the most isolated part of the trail, where I rarely see anyone, when I noticed a figure ahead of me. At first, I thought it was another runner. The person was standing completely still, looking down, wearing clothes that seemed too dark for that early in the morning. I slowed my pace, trying to figure out if it was actually someone or just a weird shadow from the trees mixed with the fog. As I got closer, it became clear it was a person, but something felt off. I called out, "Good morning," but got no response. That immediate gut feeling of unease hit me, the kind you try to ignore. I kept approaching anyway, but before I could get close enough, the figure turned and vanished into the fog. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to process what had just happened. I didn't hear any footsteps, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was like the person just evaporated. I've been on the trail during foggy mornings plenty of times, and I know sound can travel weird in that kind of weather, but this felt wrong. I decided to keep running, convincing myself it was just a local who didn't want to be bothered. But honestly, there was something about how still they were and the way they disappeared that really stuck with me. A few minutes later, as the fog started to clear a bit, I heard a scream. It came from the opposite direction of where I'd seen the figure earlier. It wasn't an animal, it was definitely human, and it wasn't just a scream. It was the kind of sound that makes your stomach drop, a mix of panic and pain. I stopped dead in my tracks and looked around, trying to figure out exactly where it was coming from. There was no one in sight, but the tone of that scream compelled me to head toward it. As I ran toward the direction of the scream, I started noticing small details I hadn't picked up on before. There were marks on the ground, like someone had been dragging something heavy or running frantically. A little further along, I spotted a piece of fabric caught on a low branch. It looked like a torn shirt, and when I picked it up, I saw it was stained with dried blood. That stopped me dead in my tracks. This wasn't just weird anymore. It was turning into something seriously disturbing. I kept moving cautiously, scanning the area, trying to figure out what was going on. Eventually, I reached a small clearing. The ground was a mess, crushed leaves everywhere and more scattered bloodstains. It looked like there had been some kind of struggle. My legs felt like they were glued to the ground, and my brain was racing. Was this connected to the figure I'd seen earlier? There was no one around, no sound, nothing. Just the eerie aftermath of whatever had gone down here. As I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I felt this overwhelming sense of dread creep over me. The clearing wasn't just silent, it was unnaturally quiet, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but of course, there was no signal out there. Then I noticed something else. A small, fresh piece of fabric caught on a bush a few feet ahead. This one wasn't dried out, it was wet with fresh blood. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, but something made me move closer. When I did, I saw footprints in the dirt. They were big and heavy, like someone had been running or dragging something. I followed them for a short distance, but they disappeared once they hit an area with rocks. That's when I heard it again. Not a scream this time, but the sound of branches snapping, like someone moving quickly. I whipped around, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. At least, nothing I could see through the thick fog. At that point, my heart was pounding, and not from the running. There was no doubt in my mind that something really bad had happened here. I glanced back toward the direction I came from, debating whether to keep looking around or just get the hell out of there. That's when I noticed something that froze me in place. Standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible through the fog, was the same figure I'd seen earlier, just standing there watching me. I tried to call out, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. When I finally managed to yell, "Hey, you!" the figure stepped back twice and disappeared into the fog again, just like before. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my stuff and started running back down the trail as fast as I could. The silence around me was unbearable, and the whole way I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. I swear I could hear faint footsteps behind me, but every time I looked back, there was nothing there. I finally reached a part of the trail I recognized, a marker that meant I was close to the parking area where people usually leave their cars. Seeing that gave me a tiny bit of relief, but as I turned back for one last glance, I saw it again. The figure was there, standing still, only this time it was closer. My stomach dropped when I realized something horrifying. It looked like the figure was facing me, but it didn't have a face. Or at least, not one I could make out through the fog. I bolted toward the parking lot and saw a couple packing up their car. I yelled for help, probably sounding completely insane. They looked confused as I ran up to them, out of breath, and asked if they'd seen anyone else coming off the trail. I quickly described the figure, but they just shook their heads and said they hadn't seen a single person all morning. Still shaking, I got into my car and left as fast as I could. To this day, I have no idea what I saw or what happened out there, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never run that part of the trail again. I've been working as a park ranger for over 7 years, and I've seen a lot of weird stuff during my night patrols, but nothing compares to what happened one cold October night about 3 years ago in a remote area of the Appalachian Mountains. I was wrapping up my rounds when I noticed something unusual, a flashing light in the distance, way off the marked trails. It was steady but flickered occasionally, the kind of thing that usually signals an emergency. I thought it might be a lost hiker or someone needing help. I grabbed my flashlight, radioed in my location, and headed toward the light. As I got closer, the terrain started getting rougher. There was no clear trail anymore, just dry branches snapping under my boots and a light fog that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. The light stayed in the same spot, almost like it was waiting for me. I remember feeling more and more uneasy. It was weird that no matter how quickly I walked, I didn't seem to get any closer. I started questioning if I should turn back, but something inside me said I had to figure out what it was. When I finally got close enough, I realized the light was coming from something on the ground. It was a drone, one of those small ones, with its light still blinking. It looked intact, but there was no one around, no backpack, no gear, not even the sound of footsteps or voices. The silence was absolute, except for the wind rustling through the trees. It struck me as odd because, for a drone to be there, someone had to have been operating it recently. The battery was still on, so it hadn't been there long. I stood there for a few minutes, scanning the area with my flashlight, trying to catch any movement. That's when I felt it, that unmistakable feeling of being watched. It's hard to describe, but it was like eyes were on me, hidden somewhere in the shadows. My first instinct was to call out, asking if anyone was there, but all I got back was the echo of my own voice. The uneasiness kept growing, so I decided to pick up the drone and head back the way I came. That's when I realized I didn't exactly know how I'd gotten there in the first place. I looked around and realized the terrain felt different from what I remembered. The trees were denser, and the ground was covered in crushed leaves, like a lot of people had recently passed through. Footprints, dozens of them, of all different sizes, some smudged, some fresh. That's when it hit me. I'd been alone all night, or at least I thought I had been. If someone had been out there, they hadn't made a single sound, and now it seemed like I'd been led straight to this spot without even noticing. Then I noticed the stuff scattered around the footprints, random things, a half-empty water bottle, a torn jacket hanging from a branch, and even a pair of leather gloves. It felt like someone had left them there on purpose. I grabbed my radio to report what I was seeing, but the signal was awful. All I got was static mixed with the sound of my breathing, which was getting heavier by the second. I don't know how to explain it, but I was absolutely certain at that moment that someone was nearby, watching my every move. I decided it was time to get out of there. I didn't take anything except the drone because I wanted to get back to the ranger station as fast as possible and report everything. But the more I tried to retrace my steps, the more lost I felt. The trees all looked the same, and the footprints didn't help. They went in all directions, like whoever was out there had been circling the area. That feeling of being watched, it didn't go away for a second. If anything, it got worse, like whoever it was knew I was trying to leave. After about 15 minutes of walking, I saw something even stranger. Another flashing light, just like the first one. This time, it was in the opposite direction of where I thought the trail was. My gut was telling me to ignore it, but my mind was racing. Whoever was out there was clearly leading me around like a puppet. And then I heard it. A loud, sharp noise behind me, like someone rushing through the leaves. When I turned around, there was nothing there, but I knew I wasn't alone. I didn't dare look back again. Instead, I started walking faster, ignoring every little noise around me. My heart was pounding, and I just wanted to get to somewhere familiar. Then, out of nowhere, I came across something that made my stomach drop. My own footprints. I'd somehow been walking in circles without realizing it. I stood there frozen, staring at the tracks, trying to make sense of it. The forest felt different now, almost like it was deliberately keeping me there. I tried to steady my breathing and think rationally, but every time I shined my flashlight, it felt like something was darting just out of its reach. I know it wasn't my imagination. I could sense it. I tried yelling again, but my voice came out shaky, barely more than a whisper. That's when I saw a third flashing light, this one much closer, practically right in front of me. There was no way I was going near it this time. Whoever or whatever was doing this was messing with me, and I wasn't going to fall for it again. I decided to turn off my flashlight and crouch behind a tree. My logic was simple. If I couldn't see them, maybe they couldn't see me. But the silence that followed was worse than anything. No wind, no rustling leaves, just dead quiet. Then I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from the exact spot where I'd been standing moments before. They weren't hurried or panicked. They sounded deliberate, like someone was taking their time, checking everything out. I stayed perfectly still, clutching the drone against my chest as the footsteps got closer. When they stopped, I could barely breathe. I peeked through the branches and saw a shadow. It looked like a person, just standing there, like they knew exactly where I was. I don't know where I found the courage, but I switched my flashlight back on and pointed it straight at the spot. There was nothing there, just trees. But I know what I saw. It wasn't paranoia. Someone was out there. At that point, I knew I had to get out of there no matter what. I decided to ignore any lights or sounds and just move. I walked as quickly as I could, trying to rely on instinct. After what felt like forever, I finally saw something familiar. A wooden trail marker near the edge of one of the main paths. Relief flooded me when I realized I was close to the ranger station. I just had to push through a short climb, and I'd be out of that nightmare. As I made my way toward the trail, I heard a loud thud behind me, like something heavy hitting the ground. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just ran until I reached my vehicle. Once inside, I locked the doors and sat there, trying to catch my breath and process what had just happened. That's when I realized something chilling. The drone I had been holding was gone. I was positive I'd had it the entire time. I don't know how, but it was taken from me. The thought that someone had been close enough to do that without me noticing still sends shivers down my spine. To this day, I can't explain what happened or who was out there, and honestly, I don't think I want to know.